In the winter of 1893, a plantation owner in Louisiana finally decided to open a door that had remained locked for 30 years. The door was hidden behind a wall of rotting wood. Everyone believed it led to an old storage cellar. But when the door creaked open, the men standing behind him heard something that made their blood run cold. Children's voices. Whispering. Inside the locked room were 12 children who should never have existed. And none of them knew what the outside world looked like. But the most disturbing part was who had been keeping them there. The Beaumont Plantation stood miles away from the nearest town. It had once been one of the richest plantations in the region. Fields of cotton stretched for miles. But by the late 1800s, the land had begun to decay. The house itself was enormous. 3 stories tall. White pillars. Broken windows. Locals said the plantation had been cursed for decades. Servants came and went quickly. Some refused to enter certain parts of the house. Especially the west wing. Because strange sounds could sometimes be heard there. Scratching. Whispers. Soft crying at night. But whenever anyone mentioned it, the plantation owner would silence them immediately. The owner of Beaumont Plantation was a man named Edward Beaumont. He was wealthy, respected, and deeply feared. Edward rarely left the estate. He kept to himself, spending most of his time inside the massive house. The townspeople described him as polite but distant. No one really knew much about him. But there was one thing everyone noticed. He never allowed anyone into the west wing of the house. Not servants. Not workers. Not guests. The hallway leading there remained locked at all times. And the key was always kept around Edward's neck. In 1893, Edward Beaumont died suddenly. Some said illness. Others believed something darker. His death meant the plantation would pass to his distant nephew, Thomas Beaumont, a man who had never even visited the property. When Thomas finally arrived, he was shocked by what he found. The plantation was practically falling apart. Rooms filled with dust. Furniture rotting. Entire wings of the house sealed shut. But the strangest discovery came on the second day. A servant quietly told him something strange. "Sir, there's a door in the west wing that no one has opened in 30 years. Curious, Thomas searched through Edward's belongings. Eventually he found the key. A heavy iron key wrapped in cloth. When he asked the servants about the door, no one wanted to speak. Finally an old groundskeeper whispered, "Whatever is behind that door, your uncle never wanted anyone to see." That night Thomas decided to open it. He brought 2 workers with him. The hallway to the west wing smelled of mold and rot. At the end stood a massive wooden door. The iron lock had rusted over. It took several minutes before the key finally turned. Then the door slowly creaked open. Before they even stepped inside, they heard something. Movement. And then a sound no one expected. Children whispering. The workers froze. Thomas thought it was impossible. No children had lived on the plantation for decades. Yet the voices were clearly coming from inside the room. They lit a lantern and stepped inside. The room was enormous. Much larger than expected. It looked like someone had converted it into a living space long ago. There were crude beds made from straw. Small wooden toys. Scratched drawings on the walls. And in the corner, 12 children stared at them. Thin. Pale. Terrified. The oldest looked about 15. The youngest maybe 5. But what shocked Thomas most was their reaction. They looked at the lantern like they had never seen real light before. The children spoke very little. Their voices were quiet. Strange. Almost like they had invented their own language. None of them knew the year. None of them had ever left the room. They said a man used to bring them food through a small hidden door. He never spoke. He only left bread and water. Then disappeared again. The description of the man was unmistakable. Edward Beaumont. Thomas searched the room more carefully. Behind one wall he found a narrow passage. It led to a secret staircase. The staircase connected directly to Edward's private study. Which meant Edward had been visiting the room in secret for decades. But that raised an even darker question. Where had the children come from? Doctors from the nearby town were called to examine the children. What they discovered made the situation even stranger. The children were not all the same age. Which meant they hadn't been placed there at the same time. Some had been born inside the room. But how? There were no adults living with them. No mothers. No explanation. Then the youngest child said something chilling. There used to be a woman here. The children explained that years ago there had been a woman living with them. She had taken care of them. Taught them words. Protected them. But one day she disappeared. The children believed Edward had taken her away. And she never came back. Thomas searched the plantation records. Eventually he found a missing persons report from 1864. A young servant woman named Clara Whitmore. She had vanished without explanation. Weeks later workers began repairing the plantation. While digging near the west wing, they discovered something buried beneath the foundation. A small wooden coffin. Inside were the remains of a woman. The name carved into the wood read, Clara. The children were eventually taken to nearby towns and orphanages. But one mystery was never solved. Who were their parents? Edward Beaumont had never married. There were no records of pregnancies or births on the plantation. And yet the children shared a strange similarity. Years later doctors noticed something disturbing. All 12 children had identical birthmarks. The same mark Edward Beaumont had carried his entire life. Which meant one terrifying possibility remained. Edward Beaumont had not simply hidden the children. He had been creating them. And the locked room was never meant to protect the world from them. It was meant to protect them from the world.